What kind of economic systems are best at allowing us to exercise the fact that we are created in the image and likeness of God?
Now keep in mind that if you take tiny steps towards any goal, it's just a matter of when you're going to reach it.
Scarcity is the first lesson of economics. Now, the first lesson of politics is to forget the first lesson of economics.
If you don't provide real, actual value to people in exchange for the money that you're asking for in return, you will lose over time.
We can see the economy as a social web that God has created for people to serve each other with their work.
We have the Word of God that provides for us a foundation for knowledge, for truth, for beauty, for goodness, for dignity and value in human beings. We have the Word of God that provides for us things like this. Ready? Thou shalt not steal.
Ethics on the legitimacy of wealth and entrepreneurship individually. Secondly, postmillennial eschatology. That is, the kingdom of God expands across the earth before Jesus comes back in final judgment. And the link to get those two together is the idea of the pursuit of self-interest leading to widespread economic growth and social transformation.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Christ in Capital, the show that wants to encourage you to love God, love neighbor, and build something. I'm the host, Dustin Johnson, and as I always say, this show is going to be fantastic. Again with me, I have Nathan Johnson, who's back from episode, what was that, 18 or 17? Something like that. Or actually, it might have been like 19. I think it was 19. Anyways, Nathan is... instead of going into like your full bio, Nathan is a teacher, a philosophy professor, a writer, a history teacher, and Nathan, we have to talk about something real quick. Mm-hmm. One day I was sitting in church, and I had known you for up to about a couple months at this point. We had had a couple conversations, and you were teaching our Sunday school class, and I was thinking, this guy knows so much about the Bible. He knows how to teach it. He knows how to communicate the messages super well. This must be the only thing this guy does. And then we go into church, and you've written a full composition for piano and chorus, and I don't know, there might have been even an orchestra part to it, that you just sat down and riffed on the piano. What was that all about?
Yeah, so I do some dabbling in music as well. I try to write choral pieces for the church, and I have enjoyed getting to do that more recently. Actually, most of the time when I write, it's for a specific thing. So I think what you heard was something that I had originally written for the high school I was teaching at the time, their choir. They were doing a production, and I decided to write them a choral piece.
That's awesome. I don't want to take up too much of our time, but have you been playing piano since you were a kid? Or
I have, yeah. Since I was 10 years old, I've been playing piano, and then I started composing, and then I decided to challenge myself to write for singing and orchestra. So still got a lot to learn, but it's a good outlet.
Yeah, it was awesome. I was floored. I think all of us were, because we were just like, wait a minute. He's a Bible teacher. He's not a composer.
Well, at the college I'm at now, New College, we emphasize the idea that all disciplines connect with one another because God is one.
Yes.
And so I try to kind of live that out in my own life and not isolate myself to one area of focus, but I try to continue to learn and develop other areas so that they all connect. And I really have found that when I try to write hymns or write music, that really connects with my love of scripture, but also my love of ideas and philosophy and culture, and it all just kind of runs together.
Does economics play into that as well?
A little bit, although I haven't figured out how to make any of my creative endeavors turn a profit. But
well, I will put a plug in here for the listeners. You have an album on Spotify. Is it just on Spotify?
I think it's on iTunes as well, and also Amazon.
Okay, go purchase it. I think you might get more money for the purchase rather than the plays on Spotify. But
that's right. Go purchase.
So go buy it. It's really good. I've listened to the whole thing. So okay, so the segue, since everything's connected, let's talk about debt.
Yes.
So we talked a few weeks ago about a paper that you wrote that was about debt. It was about our national debt. And you sent it to me, and I read through it, and I was kind of expecting like a breakdown of some sort of like statistics or the ins and outs of interest rates and debt instruments and all this stuff, and how certain ones should be used and certain ones shouldn't. But that's not the approach you took. And I thought it was perfect for the Christ in Capital podcast, because you didn't start out with that. You started out with the question, what is man, essentially? So let's, just as a backstory, so in case someone is listening to this so far in the future, just to give you kind of our context, what's going on in the world right now. There's tons of people and interests vying for money from our government, right? You got teachers unions, public sector unions, governors demanding federal funds be routed their way for their citizens because of the whole coronavirus thing. You've got people enraged that federal aid money is given to big like corporations. Congress at the time is fighting over whether to give people a $1 trillion stimulus, quote unquote, versus a $3 trillion stimulus. Yeah, and with the election, there's going to be like increased talk about universal health care, universal basic income, the whole Green New Deal thing. So everyone wants a hand in the government coffers, so to speak. And it's like there's like this vying for these a hand in the pocket, essentially. But before we address like the ins and outs of each of those those scenarios and all of that, before we address the political aspect, let's talk through your argument. And the starting point was the Imago Dei and I might pronounce this wrong, the Imitatio Dei.
Right.
So let's talk about it. Why start there?
Right. So, well, I mean, you talk a lot about on your podcast how when we think about economics, we first need to think about man and what man can produce, and man as a commodity, or your gifts as a commodity, that sort of thing. I think these sort of discussions, when we talk about debt, we can too quickly jump to the practical, like you were saying about figures and analysis and projections, and there's been a lot of brilliant stuff from economists about maybe how you can use debt in a way effectively to bolster your economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But those sort of questions, I think, lose the more fundamental reality that when we talk about personal property, we're talking about people. And when God in the Old Testament talks about personal property, the commandments against theft, against adultery, against envy, even, he is concerned with how personal property relate to individuals. And so I think if that's the case, and if everything we've been given, including all of our resources, our capital, has been given to us by God, then we need to first ask the question about what does God think about, or what does God require in terms of our capital. And so the way I kind of approach the question of debt and whether or not debt is a good thing, I wanted to first look at what is man, and how does our understanding of man answer the question about whether or not debt is good or helpful in human society. And so but then I realized that there's a lot of conversation about the imago Dei, the image of God, the inherent worth of individuals, but there's not a lot of conversation about the imitatio Dei, the imitation of God, or what God requires of individuals. And so the first part of my argument was essentially laying the groundwork for this. There's this dual identity that they both have to be held in tension with each other. The image of God is what gives man ultimate value, inherent worth, so that we can say, hey, that guy should not be murdered because he has the image of God. That guy's property should not be taken from him because he has the image of God. That guy's wife shouldn't be stolen from him because he has the image of God, et cetera, et cetera. And typically, when we think about government, it's the government's job, in a sense, to protect people because of their inherent worth in the image of God. But we can't stop there, because the other side of the coin is that God has, by giving us his image, he has also given us a responsibility to imitate him in the world. And that imitation is kind of fundamentally reflected in the law to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And this opens up, I think, a really fruitful avenue of discussion, which is the tension between personal rights, which are rooted in the image of God, right? I have a right to life. I have a right to property, right?
And that whole side of the discussion is what, like, the libertarian side and the conservative side, and they'll latch on to that, the whole, like, what I have a rightful claim to, like the rights. But then we've kind of like ignored the other part, which go ahead.
Exactly right. We've ignored the idea of interpersonal obligations, which is rooted in the Imitatio Dei. And these interpersonal obligations are just as central to what it means to be human and just as central to the flourishing of society. And so those obligations would include generosity, hospitality, basically, one of the ways I like to phrase it is that the image of God enables a person to say, this is mine. This is mine. This is my personal property. This is mine. But the Imitatio Dei moves the person to say, what's mine is yours.
Okay.
Because that's what God has done. God says the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. But yet God then gave his creation to mankind, right? And when he gives us rain to grow our crops, when he gives us resources to use, it's all his. But out of generosity, what's his, he gives to us. And so our imitation of God then is that we take what's ours by right, but then we give it. Not give 100% of your income or something. But the idea of interpersonal obligations is that when you see someone in need, love of neighbor doesn't mean that you don't say that I have personal property, but instead you say, I do have personal property that's been given to me by God, and now I want to use some of that to give to someone else.
Yeah, I like thinking about it in terms of like the way that you're postured toward other people. It's not a leaning back away from like, here's what's mine, don't take what's mine, but it's a leaning forward into, here's how I can use this to service you. Here's how I can use this to love my neighbor. Yeah. So, so one question that kind of raises in my head, and I don't want to get us off track, but so when you think about it like this, which I think most Christians have this understanding, at least at least on the surface level, we'll say, yes, we there are rights that individuals have that they're entitled to because of the image of God, and Jesus calls us to love our neighbor. He calls us to serve the the downtrodden, the orphan and the widow, those who are lowly in society. He tells us to do that, to serve our neighbor. But in society today, does that presuppose, or does it assume that we have a society that is moral, quote unquote, or religious, that they have that theological or philosophical framework that says you're required to do this? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, like it makes sense. I mean, as a Christian, that's what it makes sense with the whole worldview. But then you look out in society and you're like, how are we gonna do that? How are we gonna communicate that people have obligations? Like they have the requirement to do this by God. And I guess that comes with preaching the gospel, but I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Right.
It almost requires a optimistic postmillennial conquering of the world kind of worldview.
Right. Well, okay. So I think it's a great question. If we could back up a little bit, before we get to the how, I think it might be good to give a kind of a broader historical framework for this. There are two books that I would highly recommend for anybody to read. The first is by Simone Weil, and Weil is actually spelled W-E-I-L. She was French, and she was tasked after World War II by the European powers to come up with a plan for how to rebuild Europe, which is, wow, what a task, right? After World War II. And so she wrote down a bunch of stuff, but she died before she was able to fulfill her project. But the book that came out of it's called The Need for Roots. The Need for Roots. Okay. And in The Need for Roots, she talks about this idea of obligations as the foundation for human society. But she says those obligations to respect, to love, to give, to be hospitable, all of those flow out of the idea of rootedness. And she saw that in European society, they had become very unrooted or uprooted. So she latches onto this idea of roots, and she goes back to this, the idea of love of home and community, of family, of neighbor, of worship. And these kind of very, very fundamental relationships that create root systems that then move you to obligations, as opposed to if you just see yourself as a single individual unit of society apart from everyone else, then everyone becomes the foreigner in a sense. And it's very hard to move yourself to any sort of obligations for anyone else. Now, we personally have just kind of within us, we've got these natural kind of drives to help out a family member, unless we have like a serious rift with that family member. Maybe a close friend.
Yeah.
But for the most part, it's those close-knit relationships, the rootedness that will naturally move us to obligations. So for her, that was kind of her argument. Now, I felt like it was incomplete because we can't just say that obligations are the foundation for human society. I think we also need to bring in the idea of rights, because obligations were actually something that the ancient world had a very keen understanding of. The customs of the ancient world were very much focused on your obligations to other people, particularly hospitality, for example. So if you look at a lot of the Greco-Roman myth, they were centered on these stories of, the gods dress up as beggars and they go see who's going to be hospitable, and they go to people's houses, and those people, kick them out or mistreat them. And then, turns out, oh, that's a god. And now he, zaps you and kills you. But the people who took care of the stranger suddenly, oh, wow, that's a god. And now he blesses us. Zeus is the god of hospitality.
This is where you got into the discussion about piety and well, it wasn't really a discussion, but it was just a mention of piety. I just recently read a book called Household or The Household and the War for the Cosmos, and the author C.R. Wiley goes into like the backstory and why we need to recover piety as a thing that we embrace.
Yeah.
But anyways,
Well,
sorry,
right, exactly. And the Romans particularly had this emphasis on piety. Piety being essentially devotion to the gods, to your family, and to the state.
Yeah.
And it was rooted in this idea of duty. Now, some of that piety was kind of enforced by top-down laws, but a lot of it was enforced by bottom-up customs. Kind of, particularly in a shame culture, custom has really a lot of power that it doesn't have in a culture like ours. So in a culture like ours, yeah, we have certain customs, like there are certain social taboos, not very many, and even if you break the social taboos,
that's waning.
Right. Like,
have you seen the stuff about Netflix? Anyways, keep going.
Well, yeah, and nobody cares because actually we kind of celebrate the person who, rubs against the grain, right? But in a shame-based culture, you can have very powerful customs because everybody cares about getting honor from others. So you had that idea of obligations in the Greco-Roman world, but it turned into a form of slavery. And actually we see like there was literal slavery, and most people were not enfranchised. Most people were abused. Most people were taken advantage of. And really it was only the wealthy who could kind of operate on this sphere of custom. And even then, gets into the second book that I would recommend. It's by Peter Lightheart, and it's called Gratitude.
Okay.
An intellectual history of gratitude. It's a fascinating book. I think it's one of the best books he's written. And essentially, he looks at the ancient world, and he said that in the ancient world, they had strict customs about gifts and gratitude. But it was this very tight circle where I would give you a gift. But the only way that you can show gratitude to me for that gift is if you give me a gift in return. And so suddenly the idea of a gift, which we would put kind of normally in the category of love of neighbor, for example, it wasn't an act of love. It was actually an act of power. You can read Cicero and others talking about how the wise man is one who puts another in his debt. Okay, so I give you a gift, and suddenly you are in my debt.
Yep.
And
the borrower is slave of the lender.
Exactly. Right, exactly. And so even though it's technically not a loan, as it were, it's a gift. But in that society, there's that expectation that the only way that you can be grateful for that gift is if you give a return.
Yeah. Okay.
So this is it's a cycle of power dynamics. It's not a cycle of love and service. Now, what made Christianity so infuriating to the people in the ancient world was that Christians had a much bigger circle, because for them, every gift that a person gives is also, and more fundamentally, a gift from God. Right? So if me and my wife are struggling to make ends meet, and you give me $200 so that we can buy groceries for the month, I also see that as God has provided for us. And because of that, I still do have an obligation to gratitude, but primarily my obligation to gratitude is to God for his gift, and to you secondarily for your gift. And what that enabled, it was this idea that you give to others as God has given to you, such that you give me $200 for my food. I say thank you. I am deeply grateful to you. But when I give in return, I give to somebody else, because fundamentally I see that God has given to me. And now it doesn't matter who I give back to. I could give back to you, but I could give back to somebody else.
Yeah.
Now, in the Greco-Roman view, this was a very ungrateful thing to do. hey, I gave you the 200, or you gave me the $200. I'm supposed to give back to you.
Right.
But the Christian would say, no, God gave me the $200. I'm supposed to give back to somebody else.
Like you're saying, they, the giving was a form of not enslaving, but if the cultural expectation is that someone has to give back as like a custom or like some sort of like cultural pressure, then your gift is essentially a soft obligation for them to give back. It
Right.
sounds like a religious kind of thing. Like,
Mhm.
like I don't know. It just rings of false religion. In a
Right.
sense.
Yeah, and that's true, because these ancient customs, actually, Herodotus has a quote. He says, "Customs, king of all." These ancient customs were almost like religious duties.
Mm-hmm.
But for Christianity, because of this paradigm that everything is fundamentally a gift from God, what this enables is someone to see their obligations of love God, love neighbor, as a form of gratitude, which is very different than a form of slavery.
Right.
For the ancients, obligations were forms of slavery. For Christians, obligations are forms of gratitude. And this is paradigm shifting, because what it enables is it enables the freedom to have both a society founded on personal rights and liberty, which the ancient world did not have, but also a society that's founded on grateful obligations in response to the gifts that God has given. But this is where I find it difficult, because I really struggle with knowing whether or not one can have a society that truly fulfills this obligation gratitude paradigm without having God in the picture.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it can tend back towards the more ancient form of obligation. Or you get into this kind of weird, what we find in our own society is there are remnants of Christianity and Judeo-Christian values in our society. We're kind of haunted by those, but we don't have any power anymore. They don't have any teeth. So we'll have this idea of like, pay it forward, pay it forward.
But who says?
Yeah, right. And like, what's going to happen if I don't? And so we like the idea, but there's no real teeth to it, because we
Right.
don't have a God in our minds who has given us and who requires us to give.
Yeah. I know this
so
is sorry, I know this is kind of off topic, but I think it fits perfectly here. This is the big argument I have, or the big just I don't know, I guess the argument against the whole libertarian conservative notion of like in a lot of libertarian circles, the big motivator and the big slogan is, as long as you don't hurt me as long as you don't hurt people and don't take their stuff, then that should be what rules society. But it's like,
right.
Okay, why? Who says I have to do that? I mean, if I don't do that, obviously we have laws that are set up to do that, but what if I get someone else in here that votes that that's not the paradigm we should live by? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, and
right.
It gets into a kind of a presuppositional discussion, but like, who says who says I have to? I mean, if we're gonna take that as our like axiom that we're starting from, well, let me challenge that. Who says? And so, yeah, the whole like, there's no teeth to it. There's no like, if you don't have the creator, author of life, the one who is ruler, sovereign over all, giving the command or kind of communicating how we ought to live, then all of these like rules that we come up with are just kind of suspended in midair. They're not grounded in anything.
Right. There's a reason why Proverbs says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, right?
Yeah.
If you take out the fear of the Lord, then even the ability to see what one should do as a citizen, much less to actually carry it out, becomes very limited. particularly for the vast majority of people. Our founding fathers were pretty exceptional, and they had a lot of really great ideas. And I think that
Contrary to popular belief.
right.
But anyways.
They were right. I know in our society, it's anathema to say that they were great, but,
yeah,
the freedom that we have to criticize them is partially guaranteed by what they did.
Yeah, exactly.
But when you're thinking about just a country of 330 million people, how do we get people to do anything for each other? One of the things that I get frustrated with about the libertarian vision is that it has this idea of rights down really well.
Yes.
And
we're gonna have a discussion about this at some point. Just FYI.
Oh, good, very good. Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important discussion to have, and I think that they're right to say that the government's primary duties are to preserve and protect our fundamental rights that are based on the image of God. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
It's better than the alternative, which we see now, which is in kind of a more liberal progressive view that because nobody's fulfilling their interpersonal obligations, the government needs to fulfill those. Right? So nobody's helping the poor, well, then the government needs to help the poor, for example. Right. And we can get into that in a second for why that messes a lot of things up. But one of the problems I have with the libertarian vision is that a lot of the problems in our society, like legit problems, are caused by people who aren't doing anything illegal. Okay, so we talk a lot about one of the chief reasons for poverty, particularly in minority communities, is the problems with the family, right? Fatherlessness,
yeah,
for example, abuse. Well, yes, I mean, if there was a policeman who was always standing in the middle of a home, maybe he could prevent some of that stuff from happening. But in reality, somebody could just be an absent father. That's not illegal, right? It's not illegal to impregnate somebody and then leave. It's not illegal to get angry at your kids and yell at them. It's not illegal to do a lot of things.
It's not illegal to be lazy and not be good at your job and not do what you that's not a jab at anyone, but it's just like there's lots of things that cause issues in our economic and political setting that are not illegal. I mean, you can do them because you have the right, quote, to do that.
You have the right to do that, right? You have the right to be a really lame dad. So
wait, was that a veiled jab at me?
No. You're a great dad.
Okay.
You're a great dad. But you have the right to be a lame dad.
Yeah, that's right.
But a libertarian, or we won't even just pick on the libertarians, but somebody who only emphasizes that, hey, just don't hurt anybody else, and
don't take their stuff.
Don't take their stuff, and we'll be fine. Well, no, we won't be fine.
That's right.
And yet the alternative can't be that we make every bad thing illegal, right? This is one of those big debates, say, about drugs. And I honestly don't have a fully formed opinion one way or the other about making drugs, certain drugs, legal or illegal.
Right.
But the idea is that, okay, we tried to make alcohol illegal because there are a lot of drunk dads. And it was a very big women's movement that led to the temperance movement. And obviously, when we got a constitutional amendment about alcohol in our country for a while, which is incredible. I mean, it's super hard to make an amendment, right? And what's interesting is that statistically, alcoholism did go down, and abuse rates went down. But then we just all went back to normal. So even if you want to create laws for every bad action, it might even help a little bit. But in the end, it's not going to end up solving the problem.
Human nature is going to take back over.
Right. It's not the sphere of the government. It's not the sphere of the government.
Right.
And yet we still do see poverty as a really bad thing. And we still do see that people are in need. we still do see that there are a lot of things that can get better. But if it's not going to be the government making it better, and if it's not going to be the government just giving people a bunch of money, because we see how poorly that works, then what's it going to be? And that's where I think this other emphasis on
the imitatio.
Obligations, the imitatio Dei, has to be part of the discussion.
Yeah.
But whether or not you can get there without God, I don't know. I don't know if there can be any teeth to the claim, hey, you have obligations of hospitality and generosity to your neighbor, without saying because of what God has given you.
Yeah.
So if you look in the old,
go
ahead.
You can, but it's going to be super arbitrary. Like, it's just, I mean, people talk about purpose, having purpose for your life, and finding that purpose for what you're doing in the world, and for your job, and for your, why you do your, pursue the things that you do. But it's always just kind of that arbitrary, like, you wake up one morning and decide that this is going to be your purpose for the day. Like,
right.
It's just, there's no grounding in it. I'm guessing this is why Jesus's his command to us, his great commission to us, was to go and disciple the nations. Because I mean, it's God's world, and if you kind of try to separate him from that, then everything else, as we're talking about, just kind of doesn't, it falls. There's no support. There's no support for it. Yeah.
Right.
That's kind of the overarching thing with the whole Christ in Capital thing, is like, you have to have the obligatory, transcendental, obligatory impetus for a lot of this stuff that we're doing in the marketplace. You have to, and I don't want to make it seem like just any sort of like transcendental religious view. I'm specifically talking about the Christian biblical view. But I mean, if you like our society, if you just kind of separate that out, if you take that out, you've taken out one of the, or maybe even the majority of the legs that the society had to stand on.
Right.
So, yeah. Anyways.
Exactly. I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's one of the things that makes American history so interesting, is that I think, while it would be wrong to say that we were ever a Christian nation. I don't even know what that would mean, to say that we were a Christian nation.
Right.
A lot of the principles and ideals that went into our national ethos were directly and indirectly derived from Judeo-Christian principles of both the image of God and the imitation of God. Yeah. But of course, we get more writings on the image of God side because that's what the sphere of government is for, is to protect us, as we talked about life, liberty, property, that idea. But at the same time, of course, we wanted to be one of the first nations in the world to not have not create space for a national religion, right? We wanted to be a place that would be safe for anyone to worship in any way they saw fit. And we put that into our Constitution, which to me seems like a pretty wise idea. But at the same time, they were just relying on citizens to then carry out their obligations without anyone, even in the realm of just the social sphere, anyone requiring you to do anything. Because we didn't have a national religion, it became very difficult to have that kind of that shame culture custom sort of idea, right?
Yeah.
Because, well, my religion says I need to do this. Well, but that's not my religion.
Right. And anyone can use that argument. But...
Yeah, right. And even Thomas Jefferson, he cuts out stuff from the Bible, and Benjamin Franklin only likes certain parts of the Bible. And so even people who care about the Bible, you could take them to a verse that says, hey, you should do this. And they're like, yeah, I don't believe in that verse. I pick and choose my verses.
Yeah, not that one.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so it creates this radical individualism, which in the one sense, there's some benefits to that. You don't have shame-based social tyranny in a sense. But on the other hand, you basically just have anything goes, and I sure hope people will be good to each other.
Right.
And
yeah.
And you kind of see where that ends up. I mean, I used to go to a church in Charlotte that met in a public elementary school.
Okay.
And it was a Title IX school, like really low income place that obviously a lot of these kids are really struggling and their families are really struggling. And on the walls everywhere were all these inspirational things, and they were very moral, be kind to people, and don't give up when things are hard, and all this stuff, good things that they should know in order to live a good life. And I looked at all those and I thought, wow, I agree with every single one of them. And yet I doubt that's actually helping any of these kids live their life any better, right? It just doesn't have any teeth to it.
Yeah.
But they could go and read these things all day and then go home and they live in a single parent home and their mom's only making $18,000 a year and barely putting food on the table, and there are no good influences in their life. And no one is taking personal obligation for that kid to really love them and provide for them.
Mm-hmm.
So all the amounts of inspirational stuff they get on the walls of their school have zero teeth to them. And that's where we find ourselves.
Yep.
So then we go, well, what does have teeth? Well, the government has teeth. So then we look to the government and we say, well, then the government needs to provide for those people. This is the argument that I see with universal basic income.
Mm-hmm.
At least, I think there are some different. It's interesting because people on both sides of the aisle have thought about universal basic income, but the Andrew Yang universal basic income argument, one of the things is these people deserve. Everyone deserves a base level of income so that they can live their life. Okay, no, they don't, or at least the government doesn't. Is not obligated to give to them.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean that I, as an individual, am not obligated to give to somebody who is in need.
Right.
I, as an individual, am. The government is not.
Mm-hmm. Right.
The government cannot be your dad. The government cannot be God. But that's what we have decided to make the government, the ultimate provider of all good things. Of course, unlike God, who has unlimited resources, the government's only resources are the ones that it takes from us. So this creates a very twisted form of slavery, right? So we want the government to provide X, Y, and Z because we think we deserve it.
Yep.
And no one else is going to give it to us because nobody cares.
But even the whole deserving thing is, again, arbitrary. It fluctuates with whatever pop culture says. Like, it's just, that's why you see all these things where if you put the word justice behind whatever you're talking about, you can paint it in such a way that we need to make it a right, so to speak, like economic justice, or, with the whole critical race theory thing, there's research justice, and there's,
right.
It just put justice behind whatever you're saying, and then you can kind of like convince people that, hey, this is a right. Everyone has a right to this thing or that thing, to healthcare, to income, or to vacation at Disney World. I don't know, whatever.
Right. That's very dangerous, and it's everywhere. Rights have become the new buzzword.
Yep.
Is that if you can root something in rights or root something in this concept of justice, like you were saying, then everyone can demand that they be given X, Y, and Z.
Yes.
And of course, the only way that you can get other people to give you what you demand is to make the government make them do it.
Yep. And the teeth that the government has is, I don't know who it is that says it, but I think it might be Milton Friedman, or it might be Thomas Sowell, that says every policy at the end of the day is enforced by the point of a gun. It has
exactly.
It's force. It has to be.
It is force, and people don't realize that because it's.
We're in a democracy.
We're in a democracy, so it's through taxes. Well, yeah, okay.
What if I don't
say,
pay
well,
my
I'm not
taxes?
going to pay those taxes,
Yeah,
right? Then the government says, well, we're going to throw you in jail. And then if you say, well, I don't want to go to jail, then they will point a gun at you and say, yeah, you are going
to jail.
So, right, exactly. And that's what's ending up happening is we put everything in the sphere of rights.
Mm-hmm.
We forget about obligations because those can't be enforced, and because there's no impetus to obligation if you reject the view of God and you don't have any social custom. So then everything gets thrown in the bucket of rights. And then, this gets real insidious, is that because everything is a right, it's something that you demand, which frees you up from any sort of gratitude. So when that $1,200 stimulus check came to you in the mail or into your bank account, I doubt that you had an impulse to write the government a letter saying, thank you so much for this $1,200 check.
Right.
No one wrote a thank you note to the government for that. Everyone said, well, yeah, and they probably should have given me more. And the only reason why we're getting this is because they shut down blah, blah, blah. Okay, right.
Mm-hmm.
I deserve this. I probably deserve even more of it.
Yeah.
Maybe if you're a Christian, you say a prayer of thanks to God. God, thank you for this. And maybe that would motivate you to, tithe 10% of it or give or whatever. But most of the time, when something comes from the hand of the government, you say it's about time, or I deserve that.
And it's nameless and faceless.
Exactly.
There's no accountability, or there's no it doesn't tie it to our humanity. It's just, it fell from the sky, essentially.
Yes.
And that's symbolic. I mean, it fell from the God that you believe in, you worship, you're resting, or you're finding your provision in.
Yes,
it just
exactly.
happens to be a false one.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think you're absolutely right. This is us making the government God. And yet it's a God that we don't think, because it's a God that had to take from us in order to give to us. Right.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty vicious cycle that ends up not really fixing the problems and breeding a society of people who demand but are never satisfied and are never grateful. And because they're never grateful, they're never moved to then give in return.
Yeah.
And so this is another reason why I really think that unless you have the gospel break forth, it's going to be very hard to get people to be grateful or to love or to give. Read that book, The Madness of Crowds by Douglas Murray.
I just finished it, by the way. Everyone needs to go read it. Awesome.
It's fantastic.
And he's such a good writer, and he's funny.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways.
Yeah, he is. He's a beautiful writer. But in the end, he says, okay, here are all these problems, and here's how we're destroying Western society, and here's how we're hurting people. And I'm thinking, yes, amen, amen, amen. And then his solution, there's some good stuff to it about love and forgiveness.
Yes. Yeah.
But I'm reading this, I'm going, this isn't going to work, because you can't forgive unless you realize you've been forgiven by God. Right. You can't love unless you know that you've been loved by God. Sure, you can in small ways forgive, in small ways love, but for a whole social movement to happen, mm-hmm. you need the work of the Holy Spirit, and you need the fear and love of God, which is something that we don't have right now. Mm-hmm. Now, as Christians, though, on the individual level, we can start applying this principle of obligation to our own relationships in our lives. I think too often I get into the mindset of, well, because we have a government who does give out benefits to the poor, and because we have a government that's not going to let people starve to death, I feel a lot more free to not care.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. But just because we've set up a system where the government has replaced us in the realm of obligation does not mean that God has any fewer obligations on us.
Right.
And you see this, that if you look at giving rates in the U.S., okay, these statistics are fascinating for a couple of reasons. So people who give to nonprofit organizations, churches, stuff like that, it's incredibly low. It's like 2%, something like that, 2.5%. Now, interestingly, progressives give a fewer percentage of their income than conservatives to nonprofits. Yep. And even though the whole progressive platform is that we care, we want to provide, right?
And giving, and
right. But it's really, no, we care that the government does that,
Yes.
but we're not going to personally do that, right?
Yep.
Conservatives give a little bit more, and probably one of the reasons for that is generally religious people are more likely to be conservative.
Yes.
But even among Christians, the giving is incredibly low as compared to biblical standards, right?
Mm-hmm.
The tithe, the 10%, that's the minimum.
Yeah, right.
And you got to ask yourself, why are Christians who do realize that they have been given so much by God and do realize that everything is a gift from God, why are they still so hesitant to give and return?
Yeah, to imitate that.
Right. And I wonder, I think there are probably a lot of reasons for that. I mean, you can, some of the reasons, are you really trusting God? Do you really think that He'll provide for you? That sort of thing. But I wonder if part of it's because we're Americans. And because, we just don't have this view of obligation, gratitude that rebounds to generosity and hospitality and love.
Mm-hmm.
And I really think that this is a sphere where Christians can lead the way. Because, look, coronavirus has changed everything. And we don't really even know how much it's changed. And we're not going to until a year or two down the road.
Yeah.
But no matter what the government decides on this new stimulus package, and no matter how many stimulus packages we have in the future.
Stimulus in scare quotes.
Right.
Just for the listeners. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Because we saw what happened in the 2008 crisis.
It's not stimulating anything. It's just it's prolonging something. I mean, it's just like propping something up. It's not making anything go in the positive. Like it's not making something go in the right direction. It's just keeping it up, so to speak.
Keeping it afloat, right?
Yeah.
So this is where we're going to find plenty of opportunities for the small work of hospitality, generosity, love neighbor, give out of gratitude according to the obligations that we have rooted in our imitation of God.
Yes.
The church can lead the way in that, and there's going to be a lot of space to do that in the coming years.
So what are your thoughts on the federal money being handed out? Like, part of me is like, okay, I understand the severity of it. I understand how some people are in dire need, and one of the big talking points that these people didn't ask for this to happen. Like, it's not their fault. But I'm sitting there thinking, I'm like, who else's fault it is not? Our grandchildren's. It's not. I mean, that's essentially what we're going to have to do is throw this burden onto our grandchildren. And it makes me think, okay, maybe we just need to bite the bullet and stomach this and get into this mindset that we maybe we need to embrace discomfort for a little bit. Maybe that's good for us. Maybe we need to make some sacrifices. Maybe that's going to be good for our character. Like, obviously the whole coronavirus thing is not a good thing. It's terrible that it happened. Maybe it tells us something about how prepared we should be for in the future. But I mean, the solution is not, in my opinion, the stimulus money. It's not. It's just not a lasting solution. It's like a heroin addict just getting another dose real quick, but ultimately you're not helping, essentially. Maybe in the short term, maybe you can keep someone off the streets for a little while, but in the grand scheme of things, this is not a solution. It's not a solution.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting because Ben Shapiro, who is a libertarian, he actually supports the stimulus money. I know. Because he says, I think the argument makes sense. He says, well, it's the government's fault that people are in need, right? The government was the one who shut down business. So unlike the 2008 financial crisis, which wasn't really the government's fault. I mean, it was the bank's fault. If you're going to blame somebody, it was the bank's fault, which is kind of part of the whole industrial machine. So it made it a little bit less sense for the government to do stimulus packages and bailouts in that situation.
Yeah.
But Shapiro was like, well, because it's the government who has shut down business, it's their responsibility to make it right. But your point,
but we elected them. I mean, ultimately,
right?
Like, I mean, we made that decision, and I know Shapiro probably has a lot deeper insight into this, and he's probably thought about it way more. But I mean, it's still not the solution to throw it on our kids, our grandchildren, to stomach or to take the bullet.
Right. I think you're right. I think we too often forget that what debt is a tax on the future generations. And there, as Thomas Sowell says, what is it? The first law of economics is scarcity.
Yeah.
That you don't have unlimited resources. It's a zero-sum game. So you're borrowing from your grandkids, as you were saying. And they don't get a say in the matter right now.
Right.
They're not even born necessarily. So what does love of neighbor look like? Well, love of neighbor also takes into consideration the unborn.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And it's really nice.
We could just kill them, and so they would never have to, experience it.
Right, which is what a lot of people would say.
That's kind of a morbid joke, but it's kind of true. That's kind of the sentiment.
Here's a society that obviously shows disregard for the unborn in abortion,
mm-hmm.
but we also show disregard in the unborn in the stuff that we are forcing them to pay because of what we want now, short-term relief.
Yeah.
And it's a form of slavery.
And I've heard people say recently, or they ask the question when someone says, "Hey, we're just making our grandkids pay for this. We're just throwing it on our future generations," and they're like, "Well, who do we owe this money to?" Like, that's an argument. Like, it's who are we supposed to pay back? And I think there needs to be a really detailed, deep discussion about what monetary policy is and what it means to be so saddled with debt in our society. Like, essentially, if the United States, this is going to oversimplifying, but if the United States loses like a reserve currency status for the world, which
mm-hmm.
You can make an argument whether that's a good thing or not, but either way, if it does, our quality of life is going to go through the floor. It's going to devastate. It's going to destroy our economy. Way worse than we've seen it. And people, I think people don't understand that. We think that because everyone trusts the dollar, there's this like trust in the dollar that it's
right.
We've always been good at making good on our payments, which I'm like, where you get that from? People don't understand. They think we just can just issue the debt. We can just make more money. We can just print more money. I think the large portion of society doesn't realize that most of America's debt is owned by Americans.
That's true.
It's 70% of the debt that,
mm-hmm.
that America owes is to your neighbor, the guy down the street. And so when you think about it that way, you've set up this internal conflict between citizens. And it's this like distorted, I don't know. I've said it before on the podcast that I think we are economically illiterate,
mm-hmm.
and it shows in the decisions that we make, policy-wise.
It's true. I'm glad you bring that up. The value of the dollar, and we are kind of the backup currency for the world. It's the only reason why we have leverage over China, for example. Even though we have a big debt to China, their system is built off of the value of the dollar being strong. But once let's just say you're somebody who is actually saving up money for your grandkids. Like my grandparents did that. So when my granddad passed away, I got some money, which really helped me and helped me buy my house. That's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
But imagine if my granddad had saved up that money, and then before he was able to pay it out to me, or right when he did pay it out to me, the dollar lost 50% of its worth.
Right.
Then it really wouldn't have been able to go very far at all.
Right.
And what we don't realize is that we all have a responsibility for our own resources and taking care of our family, our children, and Proverbs says, if you're wise, taking care of your grandchildren as well.
Yeah.
But at the same time that we're saving up money for our family, we're demanding that the government do things that will make that money of less value.
Yes, exactly. This is
so we're fighting against ourselves.
Yeah, this is why I have an issue with like, I don't want to give too much information, but one of the companies that either I work for now or I used to work for, they do like guaranteed retirement income, which is like a steady stream of a certain amount payments for the rest of your life. But I'm like, look, if you live in a society where the dollar is, fluctuating like crazy, why would you set yourself into a situation where you're only getting a certain amount? Like the cost of living could far surpass the amount that you've agreed to when you're 60 years old or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And now you get to 70 and you can't even pay for yourself to live. This is why we could get into a discussion about equal weights and measures and just measurements and just weights and all this stuff, and how the dollar should be stable and all this stuff. But it ultimately boils down to like the first question that we asked: what is man? It's we are made in the image of God. We have the rights that we protected by God that are supposed to be protected by the government, but we also have that obligation to care for our neighbor, right? So that our government doesn't have to. It doesn't have to engage in these like terrible economic policies that ultimately are destructive in order to be quote unquote generous to our neighbors. That's our job. That's the job of us as a community, as a citizenry. And like we were talking about, I guess the root of that has to be love of God, love of neighbor, which is founded on Christ. I mean, it all has to boil down to what is God's plan for history? What is the purpose of this whole thing? It's redemption. It's God coming in, being the generous one to pay a debt that he did not owe, essentially. And we're called to imitate that.
Absolutely.
This is good. Really good. So I'm gonna title this article something, or this podcast something like "Forgive Us Our Debts" or something like that. But I'm thinking people might think we're gonna be talking like Dave Ramsey and talking about the ins and outs of debt financing and all that stuff. But I think this is a really good discussion to set up how we should be thinking about national debt, personal debt. Really, really good discussion. So, that's a lot.
Yeah, it's great. I'm so glad that you had me on to talk about this.
Yes. And we'll I want to have you on again. I think I'm going to have you on. Well, I'm going to ask you. Actually, we'll take this offline. So everyone, go subscribe to De Ambigua. Subscribe? Can they subscribe?
They can.
Okay.
Please do.
So Nathan runs a blogging website called De Ambigua. I'll link it to the show notes. Go subscribe. Read the articles. I started reading through some the other day when I was reading. I thought your article for this episode was on there, but it wasn't. But anyways, I started reading through a lot of other ones, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I did not realize how much you read and how deep you got into some of these like topics. It's so good. So good. So everyone go listen to it. Nathan, you said last time that you were getting some other stuff set up where people could reach you or something like that.
Yes. My new website isn't up yet, but I'm going to put most of my theological writings on De Ambigua, and then some of my more society, politics, philosophy stuff on the new website.
Okay. Well, maybe in the future I'll tag that once it gets up. Okay. All right. Well, go like, subscribe to the podcast. Click the little notification bell on YouTube. Oh, by the way, everybody, we have a new website. Go check it out, christincapital.com. Brand new website. Actually have some merchandise on there right now. If you want to buy something, there's like 1 or 2 shirt designs that you can buy if you want. Yeah, go check it out. We'll I have a lot more stuff planned that I'm going to be putting on that website. So yeah, go check it out. But until then, everybody go love God, love neighbor, and build something. Talk to you later.